Today I'm breaking down Tate McRae's Sports Car, and this track proves that you don't need a million layers to make a track sound huge. It's built on a super clean, minimal arrangement, but it still feels massive. So let's dive in. I'm going to show you how sound selection and placement can make your tracks hit harder. Okay, so we're going to break this down bit by bit. So I thought we'd start with the drums, and I'll just show you sort of the inner workings of each section and how it sort of comes together at the end. So starting with the drums, we're just going to solo them for a second. So as you can hear, it's very tom heavy. There's not a lot going on, but I think placement is really crucial here because not all the sounds that I used are exactly the same as the record. So starting with the kick. On the kick track, we've actually got a little bit of EQ, just carving it out. We're not doing a whole heap here, as you can see. We're cutting around that kind of 500 where it gets a little kind of boxy and things like that. So we don't want a lot of those frequencies in there. And we're boosting around that kind of 1K, which, you know, is often known as like the point EQ, which will give you a little bit of that punch. Taking a little bit of the lows out, not too much, because you don't want to overdo it with kicks. I used to do that a whole heap and it just ruined a lot of my mixes. So really just a minimal high pass. Next, I've got a transient designer. I use Smack Attack by Waves because I honestly just love the mix knob here. Like doing things in parallel where possible is, I think, by far superior to any other technique. So if you're doing something like compression or transient design on just a single instrument like this, the more natural and true to the original sound you can keep it, the better. So I've just used a little bit of that attack, taken the sustain down just so we can really get that punch in the kick. But the mix is around halfway. So after that, we can look at the group, and this is the processing that we have on it. I've got some soft clipping on here. So without the soft clipping, it sounds like this. Now we've got a little bit of parallel distortion on here as well, just using the stock Ableton drum bus plugin. I love that plugin. Gives you a little bit of that sort of transient design up, bit of distortion, all that stuff. It's really cool. So this is raw. Then we layer this on. And then this. So without any processing whatsoever, we're at this with the kick. Quite nice already, and that's really important. Choose a sample that already sounds good. Then once we put everything on, it sounds like this. And of course, it's not as nice in isolation, but the key here is to have it mix with the existing instruments. Make sure that it sits within the track really well. So that's the kick. And then we move on to the snare, which sounds like this. So basically, again, it's not exactly the same type of snare that they're using on this track, but the principles are the same. So we're starting with sort of a trappy kind of basic snare, and we're layering it with claps. I really looked for those kind of 90s claps, that sort of retro machine drum type of clap, and got these. That's sort of more of an 808, but then more of the loose ones like this. And if we zoom in here, we have them really sort of nudge to the right. You can use command and right arrow just to shift it to the right a little bit. It's a really great way just to get some groove into your drums. So you've then got the kick and snare so far. And forgot to mention as well, every sort of, I think every fourth-ish, there's like a splashy kind of clap here, which I've used the Haas effect for, which is basically hard left, hard right, and then just sort of nudging one of them slightly to the right. And when you have that kind of one-off splashy type of sound, it's really good just to have that either super wide or to the left or right, just so they're kind of out of the way of the original snare. So after that clap, we move to the toms, which are really the driving force of this whole drum track. So I'm going to isolate them. This is what they sound like. So they don't make a whole lot of sense without the kick, but of course they work together really well. So what I've actually used here is a contact instrument called Apocalypse Percussion. It's super cool, it's really easy to set up, and it's pretty easy to get a good sound. I've had clients tell me before that toms are the most difficult thing to mix, and they definitely can be. So I've found personally this plugin just mixes really well. And if we break the tom parts down one by one, and I typically like to split the toms into separate tracks just so it's a little easier to mix things and sort of spread them out if I want to. So here's the first layer, they're coming from either side. Then the next one. And lastly, there's a bit of a roll, which you could effectively do with the kick or the toms, but I really like the airy sound of the toms sort of leading up to that downbeat. So this is what they sound like together. And you might also hear that it sounds as if they're cutting out, and that's actually intentional. So what I'm doing here is actually ducking the volume. I'll show you on some of the automation that I have here. The volume ducks directly after this second note, and that's just so it doesn't clash with the next kick or the snare. And I really like to do that. So if you can really get into the habit of looking ahead so other instruments aren't sort of compromised by, a long tail reverb or just the air from another instrument, you'll just find your mixes are that much cleaner, and it makes a really big difference. You'll see sort of as we go how it sort of comes together. All those little things just make the biggest difference. So now when we combine it with the kick and the snare, this is what we get. And lastly, inside the drum group, there's the percussion. So this is really important, and of course it really glues the track together. So if we have a look just in solo, this is the percussion group. So we've got the hats here first up. So that's just a sort of organic hi-hat loop. And after that, we've actually got a solo triangle, which it's not my go-to for percussion, but I did hear it in this track. You can just sort of hear it pop in and out. So based on what I got from it, listening to it, this is the pattern that I came up with. And it seems like it's not doing a whole heap, but really mixed in with that hi-hat, what it ends up doing is actually adding a bit of groove and sort of putting a little bit of emphasis on certain hits of that hi-hat, which is really cool. So it comes out like this. Rather than it just sort of being straight eighths with the hi-hat. And then of course you've just got the open hi-hat here, just a sample. And again, just really making sure that it doesn't clash with that snare. In fact, I've actually let that one go. So I'm going to neaten that up right now, because if the snare is on this beat here, yeah, it is. So you don't want that hanging over to the snare. So that's a really good example. Glad I got that one out. So we put that one there, and you could even sort of let it go till the end of the bar. And then the snare is just that much cleaner. So it's not the biggest difference in the world, but I think it's just really good practice to just really tighten up that audio and let other elements really have their space. And so again, here are the drums all together. So next up, we move to the bass, and I usually like to split this up into 2 or 3 sections. So let's have a look at the very first thing that I consider when laying down a bass track like this. Aside from the pattern and it generally kind of following the kick, I'm typically looking for a sub, an 808 in this case. So I've used an 808 in Serum. I have other things like Sublab and things like that, and they are great, but I just find the simplicity of Serum just always kind of wins for me, and I always end up using it. So if we have a look at it solo, we have this. So it's pretty cool. It sounds really nice and tight. As far as the processing on the actual bass, we're looking at a little dip up to around 21. I'd probably have that a little bit less than that, if I'm being a little bit pedantic. And then we have something really cool that I love to use a lot, which is dynamic EQ. And in this case, we're actually using it to prevent clashing with the kick. So I'm setting it up on the frequency that the kick is sort of hitting at, which is sort of around, in this case, around that sort of 70 mark. I've got the dynamic EQ going, and I've hooked it up in Ableton directly to the kick, which in this case is titled this one. So of course you can set the threshold. It's really cool. It's a great feature, and highly recommend it if you can use that with your sort of kicks and 808s. Directly after that, so I've rolled off a bit of that top end as well, just sort of what I didn't need, and you'll see why in a second. Directly after that, I've got the saturator. Again, I love the option to use a dry wet. So again, I've got it at around 23%. I've got some drive on there and just not really pushing it that far. I've also used the soft clipping function, which is essentially rounding out those peaks, which can be really nice on something like an 808. Rather than sort of crushing them with like a hard distortion, soft clipping is just really nice for that. And I use it all the time. So directly after that, I've got a bit of limiting. Not much gain reduction going on here. It's just to really tame those dynamics, because of course 808s can tend to pop a little bit in the mix, which can be a great thing, but you know, with my sort of general style, what I generally like the sound of, I like sort of things to be nice and leveled and ironed out. So that's why I use a limiter at the end of the bass there. Just before we go to the next sort of parts of the bass, I'm looking just at the bass group here. We're doing a little bit of side chaining just on that lower end. I know we did the dynamic EQ with that particular kick frequency as well, but doing a little bit of this sort of ducking of that lower end can really help it along too if you find that, you know, the dynamic EQ is not doing what you want or to the extent that you want it. So that's what I sort of found with this. It sort of wasn't clean enough. I just wanted to really sort of sync that kick, and this really helped me do that. Okay, so moving on to the layers for this bass, again, which are really what gives it the character in the Tate McRae track. I've got this track here called Fuzz 1. So basically this is a Serum preset that I've just sort of played around with a little bit. You can get almost any respace preset with this and just sort of play around with the cutoff, play around with the attack and release, the decay, and just sort of shape it the way you want it and just so it fits your track. It's exactly what I did here. It's just a basic Reese preset, and this is what it sounds like. So it's a pretty cool sound, and this is what the general EQ looks like. We've taken some lows out up to around 125. Could probably even go lower if you wanted to, but it needed sort of a little bit more of that sort of thickness I found. Didn't really do much to the EQ other than that. Then we just sort of lifted some of the hairs on it with a tiny bit of saturation, again, just in parallel. Then we've soft clipped it. So we've really just rounded out a lot of those peaks, squashed it a little bit because we want it to really just mesh in with that 808. And then we spread it out a little bit. The reason I'm spreading this out, you've probably been told never spread out a bass, and that's pretty much true. But if you're splitting it up and if you're using the higher end of a bass sound, you know, it's okay just to kind of widen that a little bit, which is what I've done here. And that's using Ozone's Ozone 9 imager. So there's one other cool trick in the bass that sort of allows these sort of respaces to sit with more of a sub. So what you want to do is on the first oscillator, just hit the pencil, go process, and then hit remove fundamental. And that basically removes the fundamental tone from each note that's played. So it's not clashing with the original sub bass, which is going to carry those fundamentals for you. So I've done the exact same thing, but basically an octave lower. I might have played around with some EQ things and things like that. As you can see, yeah, we took a lot of things out here, but basically it's the same thing and it's just an octave lower. Sounds like this. And then all the bass together. And so with the bass and the drums. So as you can hear, it's slowly coming together. The next thing that we want to look at are these vocal chops. So if you have a listen in the background of that chorus to Sports Car, you can hear these vocal chops, which just really, they make for a cool entry into each kind of bar, each phrase. So this is what they sound like in isolation. I'll show you what I did. It's really simple. I didn't work with a vocalist on this particular track, obviously, so I just found a little vocal chop, which was a little more elaborate, and just found a little piece of it, pitched it up to where I wanted it, which is quite a few semitones higher, and did the same for this one. So the only other thing that I really added was some reverb, pretty washed out, and a pretty long tail. There's no side chaining on these. I also took out some low end, but there's no real side chaining on these because I really just want them to sit along the top and add that atmosphere. And of course, they're panned both left and right just to add a bit of interest, a bit of movement. And that's really it for those vocal chops. It's very, very simple. And on that note, there's a little synth line that happens in the verses too. It might be slightly different, but in the chorus, it sounds like this. I think the beauty of this is that there's no other elements sort of supporting it other than that little vocal chop. There's no big chordal pad underneath it. It's really the bass and this type of line that's carrying the harmonic structure of this section. So all I did was find pretty much a stock. It was one of the first stock sounds that I found in Serum. I literally just went to leads, scrolled down a little bit, and then I just, again, adjusted the sound. So it was bending the pitch a lot in this particular preset. But of course, I just took some of the modulations off and it became a lot sort of straighter, which I really liked. Took a little bit of the low end out, as you can see. There was only a little bit of build up towards that end. And then I sidechained it. So again, this is working with the kick, ducked it pretty hard because I felt that, in the actual record, it did have a bit of that pumping effect. And it was sort of being pressed under that kick. And this just tightened it up really nicely. So that's really every single layer for that entire chorus pretty much. So the only other thing I had here was the vocal, which I ripped from the original song just for fun, just for learning purposes, of course. I managed to find that kind of whispery vocal and obviously just wanted to see what it sounded like in the track that I've recreated. So I'm going to show you that with the entire track now. Yeah, so of course, not mixed to my track, and it was just really pulled out with AI essentially. So of course, if you're doing this exercise, you're recreating tracks and trying to get some sort of insight into what other producers are doing. It's really nice to have just a vocal in there to ensure that your track can actually support the vocal. Because sometimes, you'll make something, put the vocal on top, and you'll be like, why is this not sort of moving? If you don't have that experience working with vocalists, it's really good to have that sort of sense of what it's like to have a vocal in your tracks and learning to carve tracks around the vocal too. So that's basically it. The last thing I'd want to show you, I didn't really include any effects in this. The last thing I'd want to show you is just a couple of things that we did to the master. This looks like it's a lot, but of course they're only doing sort of little things bit by bit. Started out just with some EQ, and of course just pumping that sort of low end where that kick's sort of hitting. Next thing I've got is some compression. After that, again, some soft clipping. This is really what can give you that radio ready type sound. So I just want to show you without the soft clipping, just so you sort of see what it's doing. So here it is without. Then with. So that's really cool. One of my favorite plugins. And another one of my favorite plugins, Soothe 2. And I'm just using the Mastered by Goodwin. I believe that's Josh Goodwin. His preset on Soothe 2 is really nice. Again, just soft, and I've pumped up the depth a little bit, just more or less using the preset here. So again, this is bit by bit. We're not doing anything too drastic. After that, we're widening the track slightly. So I've kept the lows of the track pretty close to the middle, and then just really around those sort of high mids, I'm just starting to really spread them out a bit. And that's again using Ozone 9 Imager. And lastly, I've got, again, just a staple in my production setup, which is T-Rax 5. Absolutely love this plugin. It's got a bunch of sort of knobs on here that you can use to really shape the track, especially when you're referencing something like the focus and the air, just really help you match that sort of EQ or just general sort of balance, tonal balance within the reference track. So this is a great plugin, highly recommend it. And yeah, I use that for just about any mix. So just so you can see what it's doing without it, here it is. So everything up until here, I kind of consider mix bus processing. And I suppose maybe, it's debatable, probably from standard clip onwards becomes mastering, just so you know. So it's like EQ and compression. I don't necessarily consider mastering. I more consider that pre-mastering and just really kind of shaping the actual mix itself. So then with. And we've got a couple of other plugins on here. Reference 2, this is actually what I use to reference the track. This is the plugin that I use just to basically get a sense of the reference, not sort of striving to get it exact, but just pretty close is all I'm really aiming for here. And this is a plugin that I've been playing around a little bit. As you can see, I'm still on the demo. It's part of the NX series by Waves, which basically gives you sort of a mix room simulation, which is really nice. And then of course, if you're using headphones, it's a great idea to have something like SonarWorks Reference, or I think it's now Sound ID is the latest one. This calibrates my HD 650s, which is really nice to have, but just flattens it out, as you can see. So if we take it to the left so it's dry, that's what my original headphone EQ looks like. Take it to the right, and it's a nice and flat frequency response, which just helps you get a slightly better mix when referencing on headphones. And again, I don't recommend purely mixing on headphones. If you have speakers, if you have the option to kind of mix in a space, I would always take that option. If you have some kind of a space, whether it's a living room, bedroom, It's often better if you can, treat it and get used to it and sort of use that in conjunction with headphones if you have the option. But of course, there are plugins like these that really help you get something half decent in headphones. So the very last thing I want to show you are the return tracks. So of course, I didn't do much to the vocal here. I think I added a little bit of parallel compression just on the first send. So that's basically just a compressor. All the settings are turned up to the extreme. And they're blended in with the original vocal. Probably didn't need it. It's probably overprocessed at that point because this vocal's already mixed. It was ripped straight from the track. But if I had a raw vocal, that's definitely something I'd be doing. The next thing I have is delay, which I didn't use this time. Then the drum parallel compression. As you can see, it's not doing too much, and I only introduced a little bit into the drum track. I try to level match it where possible. And what it does, it basically introduces some energy into that track, and it makes all the difference. It really helps it pop in the mix. But then, of course, I have a couple of vocal reverbs. So this is a longer one, and then the one I'm actually using here, just for that, again, that mock vocal, it's a lot shorter. I use Pro R a whole heap, and 0.93 seconds. It's super short and just gives you that sense of space and width for the vocal, which is really nice. And that's essentially the whole track. Here it is without the vocal. If you enjoyed this breakdown, check out the video somewhere on this screen. It's packed with a bunch more production techniques that you can use right away. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more breakdowns and production tips. I'll see you in the next one.